subordination of teaching to learning is knowing that knowledge is the result of something the learner does. It's using devices such as words and color charts and Cuisenaire rods to place the emphasis on the student's learning and not what the teacher is doing. It's the teacher's responsibility to construct challenges to generate awareness in students. In doing so, the teacher needs to ask the right questions, monitor feedback, utilize mistakes to promote learning, and be flexible. For me, feedback is more than looking at the outcomes of my students' learning. It's a way to subordinate and look at the process of my students' learning. I'm continuously monitoring their feedback throughout my entire lesson. To do this, I need to be alert, willing to listen and pay attention to not only what my students are saying with words, but what they are saying with their actions as well. I'm always asking myself, are my students present? And not just physically, but mentally and emotionally too. Examples of feedback can range from raising an eyebrow, rolling the eyes, a deep inhale, falling asleep, a smile. All of these postures, gestures, and facial expressions help me to better serve my students. When I think of a personal example of monitoring feedback while subordinating my teaching to my students' learning, one student always comes to mind. I was working one-on-one with her, doing two-digit subtraction with borrowing, and I felt the lesson was going really well. I was asking all the right questions. The student was engaged and she seemed to really be enjoying what we were doing. Then we were in the middle of a problem and she paused. She started to stare really intently at the rods and look confused and unsure of what to do next. Then a tear fell, and I began studying her facial expression and her body movements, trying to gauge whether or not I should intervene. So I made the decision not to intervene because her hands seemed to be resting comfortably on the table and her eyes told me that she wasn't angry. She was working on it. She knew what she had to do. She just had to find it. She was at the edge of her frustration level, but she hadn't fallen off yet. She was thinking intently, and she needed time. So I made the decision not to jump in and gave her time to work on the problem. And sure enough, a couple minutes later, she manipulated the rods and looked up at me and said, "Finished," with a big smile on her face, and she wiped the tear away. She was then able to explain to me step by step how she reached her conclusion. Looking back on that instance, I am able to see the power of feedback and the importance of monitoring feedback. That student didn't need me to jump in and tell her what to do. She just needed time to work it out on her own because she knew what to do. She just had to find it.
The subordination of teaching to learning is more than a state of being. It's a way of interacting with students. The approach asks me to look at myself not only as a teacher, but also as a human being. It invites me to experience who I am, how I function, how I relate to my world, how I learn. Through such reflection, I have gained insight into myself as a learning being, and this has made me wonder and think of others as also being learning beings, and appreciate my students as such. Every day shows me that they are doing an incredible amount of work while they are functioning, as I continue to explore how much work I am doing while I function. I no longer see my students as empty vessels whom I have to fill with knowledge, but instead as these incredible beings that have already managed to accomplish so much by the time they come to me. I was working with a child that was having trouble reading fluently. She seemed to know most of the sounds on the Fidel, but she still was having troubles with fluency. I decided to take her to Primer 1. We started over here, number 1, with the sound "ah," which is the first sound that the kids are introduced to with our words and color program. This line correctly would be read "ah, ah, ah, ah." For some reason, my student kept reading "ah, ah, ah, ah." I couldn't quite understand why she was making spaces in between the sounds when the letters were together. So I kept tapping it out for her. I took my pointer and I was tapping the way I thought it should be said. she would say it correctly. Then I would not tap. I would ask her to read, and again, she would say it incorrectly. I was really confused as to why this was happening. After going back and forth so many times, finally, I put the primer down and I asked her, why are you doing this? Why are you making a space between the letters when there is none? She looked at me really confused and she said, but what are you talking about? I pause a lot when there's a big space, and I pause a little bit when there's a little space. And all of a sudden, I could see what she saw. I was shocked. I never thought that something like this would hinder a child in reading. She was so meticulous at reading that she was noticing that between the first A, there was a large space, which is the space that would come between words, and between the second set of A's, there was a little space, which is the space that would come between letters. To her, logically, it didn't make sense why you would say them together if there was a space there. So I told her, I understand. I understand there's a space there, but we pretend it's not there. After that, she read line 1. She read line 2, 3, all the way down. I was so surprised. And from this experience, I realized that instead of focusing on what a child is doing wrong, I should be focusing on what she's doing right. This child was so careful that she really, really wanted to do it correctly. She really wanted to make the pauses where the spaces were. And from this experience, I've really learned that I have to put myself into the child's realm and stop focusing on what I want to teach them and see what they're trying to tell me that they know.
For me, subordination of teaching to learning has several components, mainly self-awareness, reflection, belief that my students have the inner tools to accomplish the task at hand. Does this way of working keep a love of learning? Basically speaking of feedback, whether verbal or non-verbal feedback. And another component is learning autonomously. To explain what I mean by students learning autonomously, I will share an experience that happened while I was teaching a social studies lesson on the topic, my community. Each day, my understanding of subordination of teaching to learning is coming alive. Recently, I was teaching a social studies lesson, the topic being, what is a community? For the social studies lesson, students were already placed in tour groups because the theme for 3rd grade social studies this year is World Travelers. I had 3 centers set up in the classroom for students to tour: a computer center, book, and a video center of communities around the world for each student to explore. Each child spent 15 minutes in each center listening, watching, and reading about various communities around the world. At the end of the lesson, I had a reflection circle. I asked, how was it? Is there anything you want to share? What can you say is a community? Students had interesting responses. One student, Alexandria, said, a community is a place where people live. There is a community in Egypt. Its name is Alexandria. It is in the continent of Africa, and there's a famous man named Alexander the Great. My name is Alexandria, so that was interesting. I was blown away. I was taken aback with her response. I then had other students sharing about communities they read about or watched. In the end, we had a class definition of the word community. I believe if I had said, this is the definition of community, blah, 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 study it for your next test, I would have somehow imprisoned the student. Alexander would not have been able to explore on her own and learn new things. I would perhaps have told her the definition. Looking back, I think if I'd been in a traditional sense of teaching, I would have told her the definition of what is a community, and then given her an activity sheet, and of course required her to study it for her next test. However, after being retaught and exposed to the subordination of teaching to learning, I was able to free my students to be autonomous and creative.